He gave the Emperor everything. And you? The Imperial Guard has been guarding the Imperium for millennia. Billions of men have gone into battle time and time again to protect humanity from any threat that might emerge from the cold void of space. Of course, they are not the only ones who give their lives for the glory of the Emperor of mankind. However, of all the undoubtedly worthy defenders, the Guardsmen are not only the most numerous, but also the bravest. After all, it is not unusual to perform feats and win glorious victories as Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's angels of death created solely for war, or to stare into the eyes of inevitable death without fear, being Scitari of the Adeptus Mechanicus, that physically incapable of experiencing terror. This is what makes the Imperial Guard stand out, because its soldiers are undoubtedly capable of all of the above, while being the most ordinary people. However, the cruel reality still takes its toll. The average lifespan of an ordinary guardsman is disastrously short, and very often, instead of the joy of victory in a glorious battle, the soldier faces the most ordinary, often horrible or even ridiculous death. Still, the common man is no match for the skills and fortitude of those same Astartes. However, even death could often be a far preferable outcome to what awaits those unlucky enough to survive a lost battle, whether it be the result of betrayal, cowardice, or trivial chance. Any battle is unpredictable and dangerous, and no one is immune to the occasional splinter, bullet, or contusion. And so a guardsman who has lost consciousness on the battlefield opens his eyes while tied to an altar, lying on a dirty operating table or in a cage, realizing with horror that the worst thing that could happen has happened. Being captured during combat in the real world today far from always means an instant death sentence, as in the case of an Imperial Guardsman. However, the latter situation is much worse in any case. Still, those who oppose the Emperor's warriors, less often than in mercy, can only be accused of being civilized, and often a soldier's life saved means only that he will die a little later, most likely a much more horrible death than the one that could have overtaken him on the battlefield. However, even among the enemies of mankind, there are those who are the worst to be captured. After all, if the same Ta'ao are a relatively good option, the captivity of Orcs or Dark Eldar will be the most real hell for anyone who will suffer such a fate. But the most terrible fate of the Guard can undoubtedly be called the captivity of the services of pernicious forces. After all, if in the case of the Dark Eldar or Orcs at least you can more or less predict the development of events, then what can await a man in the hands of those who chose the path of service to the Dark Gods, no one can say for sure. The perverted mind, mixed with almost limitless knowledge of Tzeentch's servants, the sick and very rich imagination of Slanesh's servants, the cruelty of Khorne's followers, and the very nature of Nurgle's children can lead to the most unexpected results. Unless, of course, you go straight to the altar as a sacrifice for another ritual. However, even the Chaos cultists often need trivial laborers or tongues with the necessary information. It was as such a captive that Dantine, a retired Imperial Guard captain, fell into the hands of the Nurgle worshippers of the vanished Death Guard. The monster catches him in mid-leap. Claws snap across his chest, holding him rigid. His weapon spins away uselessly, and Dantine finds himself staring straight into the creature's face. The mask is huge, well beyond anything human. He can see tubes snaking under the cracked rim, throbbing with dark liquids. He can see flies crawling all over it and glossy sores on the tarnished ceramite. He can see a pair of lenses backlit with eerie green light, as thick as cream. He can see numbers written all over the ridges of barnacled armor, vanishing into impossibly small characters. Dantine spits in its face. The spittle curdles as it hits, turning lumpy like old cheese. He hears a rumble from within the carcass of the monster and realizes it's a deep, corrosive laugh. There's nothing human about that laugh. The voice is too ruined, too overlaid with corruption and distortion and slow malice. "Kill me then!" Dantine dares it, raging now, more angry at the blasphemy than afraid. The monster looks at him for a while. All Dantine can see is its dark lenses, unblinking and unknowable. Then it shakes its head. "Not you!" it slurs. It squeezes gently, and Dantine can feel himself passing out. Dantine was captured during a raid on the planet Navy. The Death Guard warband, led by Chaos Lord Vorks, forced to retreat from the battle in Cadia's orbit, came out of warp near the planet. However, by the time the Chaos Forces ship Solace was in real space, the battle on Cadia was already over. The planet had fallen, and the galaxy was split by a giant warp storm that would later become known as the Great Rift. Finding themselves in the Dark Imperium, without any navigational data and having lost the light of the Astronomicon, the forces of Chaos travelled to the nearest planet, with the goal of figuring out where they were and what to do next. Of course, the small world was not prepared for such a thing, and the people on the planet were doomed. However, Vorks and his wars were not so much in need of casualties as they were in need of information. The main purpose of the attack was to provoke the Imperials to retaliate, to start a war. However, this did not happen. The colossal warp storm cut off communications not only to the forces of Chaos, but also to the Imperials, and they simply could not call for reinforcements. The planet's defences were literally swept away, and the world fell into the hands of the Lords of Silence, Dantine. The sun comes up. Garstag walks out to the far edge of the complex in order to observe it. It is a little right for him, a small habit that he sees no reason to extinguish. After every successful action, he makes sure to see the sun come up on the worlds he has conquered. He has seen many suns rise, blazing blue-white orbs that sent shadows leaping across the rocks, mid-range yellow stars that must be reminiscent of terror for those who remember it, and ones like this one, old and tired and amber, filling 1/16 of the sky with a weary light. The complex is still burning. Slurt discovered Prometheum tanks and set them off. After that, he drove a few survivors into the Inferno, where they were caught between death at his hands and death in the flames. It was a poor game, that one the Cardin Master disapproved of. They deserved a chance to die on their feet. Former Imperial Guard Captain Dantine, who commanded the defense, was captured and sent aboard the Solace. When he finally came to his senses, a rather unpleasant picture appeared before his eyes. Then he stops dreaming. Much later, very much later, consciousness returns. He blinks, and a shifting world comes back into something like focus. He feels horribly ill, more than normal for a void transit. He is lying on his back, and he twists over to be sick. He sees the vomitus slap onto the floor, thick and greasy, and the smell appalls him. Then he lies on his back again, panting. He is clammy and cold, and he shuts his eyes. His chest hurts. He does not want to be alive. That thought prompts him to force himself awake properly. Perhaps there is something he can do about that. Spite the enemy before the advent of whatever questioning or torment they have in mind. He blinks again hard, clearing room from his eyes. He tries to get a sense of where he is and what has happened. He is inside a cell, metal-lined, metal-floored. It stinks. Some of that stink is from him. His uniform is soiled, and his various excreta reek. Foul matter is caked on every surface. The metal is heavily oxidized, stained and calcified. The floor is wet, and little bubbles pop to the surface of oily puddles. He is on a long bench, also metal, also rusting away to nothing. The lone lumen is a chain-suspended sodium lamp, as dirty as everything else. There are furry things with many eyes crawling up the walls. Dantine wipes his mouth and tries to sit up. His rib cage is the worst. He must have been hit hard there. His knife is gone, of course, as is anything else sharp. Dantine was kept alive for one reason only. He stood out from the rest of the defenders. On the surface of Navy, the Lord of Silence was confronted by mostly farmers, and the former Imperial Guard captain instantly caught Vorks' attention because, he said, he looked like someone who knew how to hold a gun. Vorks was not mistaken. During the interrogation, Dantine told of the planet Sabatine, which was nearby, and where the fortress monastery of the Order of the White Consuls was located, a more than worthy target for the Lords of Silence. Of course, the former captain did not want to answer Vorks' questions. However, he simply could not. Something was compelling him to speak, and he himself couldn't figure out what. Until at some point, the leader of the warp band showed him the awful truth. Who was Dantine really now? Dantine tries to clench his fist. As the monster speaks, he attempts to gather the strength to lunge at him again. When he cannot do so, he slumps against the bench. defeated. "I wish to hurt you," he says mournfully. Vaux stops pacing. "Of course you do. I do not blame you for that, but I cannot allow it. See, we have arts for this." He reaches down to one of the many pouches at his belt. He rummages for a moment and then draws out a thick bag, stained black from the liquids within. He moves closer to Dantine, opens the bag and brings something out. For a moment, Dantine does not know what it is. Then he thinks it is raw meat, offered as sustenance. Then he sees that it is a heart, blotchy with blood, and that it is still beating. The grisly spectacle makes him recoil until a greater horror dawns on him. His hands fly up to his chest under the ripped jerkin of his uniform, and he feels the ridge of scar tissue there. Vaux puts the heart back in the bag and ties it to his belt again. "Your first lesson," he says. "How are such things possible? They are not in the only world you have ever known, but there is a greater one in which all things are made possible." Dantine is hyperventilating. He cannot bear to touch the wound at his chest anymore. It makes him feel dizzy. "How did—" he starts. "Hush," says Vaux, holding a stumpy, calloused finger to his Vox grill as he moves back to the door. "Enough for one day. You will need to rest if you are to be of service." "How am I alive?" Vaux looks at him. "Are you sure that you are, Captain?" He opens the door and steps across the threshold. This discovery horrified Dantine. Now he could not even be sure that his life had been preserved. He tried to pray, but could not recall a single word of the texts he had memorized so well. The forces of chaos are quite inventive when it comes to bullying, and can do a lot not only to a person's body, but also to their mind. The Nurgle are no exception, though they themselves do not consider their actions to be torture of any kind. The Lord of Decay is very kind to his followers. He doesn't like them to be in pain. Much less can he let them die. And his followers share that sentiment, even if in their minds it takes a truly horrible form. Dantine began to change. He felt that he was sick. The scar on his chest was constantly oozing pus, and it felt as if there was another living thing inside him. But the worst part was that as time went on, he worried less and less about it. No one on the ship showed the slightest sign of aggression towards him anymore. A good guardsman would certainly have tried to sabotage him, to die and take as many of the brats with him as possible, but Dantine didn't want to. He didn't even think about it. All he had to do was fight for the remnants of his humanity, keeping consciousness and memory of who he was. His heart was still with Vaux, and the former captain was under his complete control. But then they tell Dantine to go to Narjan again. The smell is just as it was on Narjan once the monsters broke into the compound, only intensified. The ship is stained hard with it, from every rivet and bulkhead to every lumen and plate bolt. The air is oversweet, the corridors are dark and hemmed in. At times he imagines he has been swallowed by this place and is being slowly digested. At times he feels as if the ship is a stomach, moist with juices and ripe to contract around him. At times he feels as if the ship is alive. A council was taking place on the planet's surface. Vaux and his commanders were deciding what to do next. They could have stayed on Navy to reward him with Nurgle's gifts, but there was no point in that. They could have travelled onward to Ultramar. But the lack of communication and normal navigation made it a one-way trip. The third option was Sabatine, the very world Dantine had told them about. It was the destination chosen by the Lords of Silence. They turned to Dantine without further prompting. 6 pairs of green lenses, some angled, some round as navels, swivelling to focus on him. The effect is like a punch, and he stumbles back half a step. "You will take us to your old home world, won't you, Captain Dantine?" Vaux asks. There is only one answer to the question. He no longer has a will of his own. He no longer has a life of his own. He is a puppet now, a shadow within a world of ghouls and mists. It matters not that he cannot read the warp, nor that he cannot pilot a starship. His soul clings to his body despite its mortal death, tracing a slender path across the dark firmaments of both space and time. They can use that, so he bows, like a slave bows. "Yes, Lord," Dantine says, breaking just a little more inside. From that moment on, Dantine was no longer a prisoner, even if he did not realize it. No one restricted his movements on the ship, and no one showed the slightest sign of aggression toward him. He had become one of them, though he tried to deny it with all his might. Dantine sees none of this. He's more mobile than before, limping from chamber to chamber, driven now by a curiosity that outweighs his fear. He estimates that there are thousands of men and women like him on this ship, probably tens of thousands. Few of them ever speak to him. As far as he can tell, few of them ever speak to one another. They seem strangely content, stumbling across the decks just as he does. Some have tasks most do not appear to. This is a listless ship, and yet it functions somehow. On a naval grand cruiser, this level of lassitude would have seen the captain executed and the ratings given heavy beatings. The commissariat would have come in, sweeping level by level, restoring fear and efficiency, getting the chains of command pulled taut again. The people here are not afraid. Some are sick, very badly sick. Most are carrying obviously terminal diseases, and their bodies are falling apart, but they are not afraid. Dantine begins to realize it has been a very long time since he has been among people who do not possess fear. He resists the urge, the dangerous urge, to think of this as a good thing. It is likely, he reflects as he wanders the decks, that this ship, this Solace, has a self-perpetuating community, much as a big imperial starship does. There will be children born in the bilges, raised in the sticky darkness, learning a trade in the shadows. There will be strange hierarchies, the upper decks unimaginably far off and prestigious. The gun gangs and ammunition haulers, an aspiration, the shit shovelers and slop servers, the likeliest occupation for any who survive the knife fights of the underdeck. They brawl with one another and jostle and protect, rut, perhaps even love. Then they die. All is done in the stink, the dark, the heat. This is an alien world, as alien as Dantine has ever encountered. The filth is phenomenal, burned deep into every surface, so that it feels less like an encrustation and more like the very matter of the world around them. And yet these souls persist here, against all odds, eking out short and strangely fecund lives before the phages bite, after which their superannuated bodily remains are scraped into boiling vats and served up to the next unknowing generation. He tried to speak to them a while back. He thought it might help if he exchanged a few words. Deep down, a part of him even thought that he might be able to find a few whose spirits had not been crushed, and he had visions of raising some kind of rebellion. He spoke to a woman first, tugging at her insect-eaten cloak and making her stop and look at him in the dark. "What is your name?" he asked. Her face was drawn, a pull of skin across bone, her eyes bulging like those of a mantis. She seemed unable to focus on him, and a line of black drool ran from her cracked lips. 47, she said. "That's your name? 48? What? 49. He found out after that a lot of them count. They mutter away in the deep, scratching for food or something cool to slap on their boils and sores, and they mumble numbers mindlessly over and over again. After that, he found a man, perhaps his own age. He grabbed him by the shoulders, dragged him into the lee of a big engine bulkhead, and forced him to talk properly. As he did so, hot sparks from the turning shafts spat and wriggled, cooling across the muddy deck. "Tell me your name," he said, summoning up as much of his old sense of command as he could. "Captain Dantine," the man replied, looking terrified. "No, that's my name. Just tell me your—" "I'm dead. I have no heart. I'm a curse and a warning." The man smiled, a sick grin that exposed gums as red as heart's blood and black holes where the teeth should have been. That was the last time. Now Dantine ignores the crowds that fill Solace's corridors. The Lords of Silence descended upon Sabatine. Of course, Dantine had no desire to ravage the planet he had been born on, nor did he want to fight against those he considered friends. He would have liked to be lost somewhere in the bowels of the ship, locked away in some dark cell, and hope with all his might that he would be forgotten. But that was not to be. The whole horror was that no matter how hard Dantine tried to remember who he was, no matter how hard he tried to keep himself safe, it was all pointless. He found himself in a crowd of others like him, with a rusty lasgun in his hands, with a half-discharged, acid-oozing battery. It is ironic that the former captain was nicknamed the Unchanged. Perhaps it was because of his desire to retain his humanity. Dantine had fought on many worlds, however, none of the battles he had seen were like this one. Here there were no orders or ranks, just a sick, distraught mob tearing at the barricades, falling under laser fire. Without realizing how, Dantin himself was able to get close to them without firing a single shot. From somewhere, a desperate hope suddenly kindles. He holds his gun up, holds his other hand up and staggers towards the nearest barricade. "Do not fire!" he croaks. "I can fight with you." This is the only way out. One last time, fighting with those he has doomed. If he kills one of the monsters this way, just one of them, that would be something. He gets closer and can see the glint of grey helms over the heaps of rubble. "Let me!" he shouts. The first shot hits him in the shoulder, throwing him back. The beam slices straight through, punching the mesh of his uniform and fizzling out the other side. He reels and drops to one knee. Then another one hits him, slapping into his chest and hurling him onto his back. It doesn't hurt. It is just cold. He feels a trickle of blood in both wounds, but it is black and stinking. He rolls over, coating himself in mud. Both those wounds should have been fatal, but he is still breathing. He tries to lift himself and his arm gives out. He collapses back to earth and his face hovers for a moment over an oily puddle. There is a flash in the skies, some starburst of munitions going off, and for a fraction of a second he catches his reflection in the water. No wonder they fired. He barely looks human. His eyes are bulging, his cheeks hollow. His old uniform is just rags now, exposing a horrifying body, jutting ribs, swathes of bile-greased fat. He has no teeth. When did he lose those? Just an empty mouth that runs with bloody saliva. He has no hair, and the skin on his scalp is flaking off, uncovering the skull beneath. He hangs there for a moment over the water, staring. If he still had a heart, it would be hammering. His fists clench, dragging through the bloody gravel. He wants to scream, but he has already done so much of that. This is how I look to them. Everything was useless. All the efforts made to preserve his identity were meaningless. Dantin had ceased to be himself the moment his heart was cut out. Now he couldn't even remember what he looked like before his capture. The realization of this fact drove Dantin into a rage, and he finally gave in. He unleashed his anger on those he had once fought alongside. In his unconsciousness, he began to kill. He opens fire. The laser gun whines, sending the first shot into the night. Then he fires again and starts to walk. Soon he is joined by the others, and they advance in something like formation. The fires roar overhead, smoke tumbles across the cityscape, and it coils around his boots. He will be at the barricade soon. He will be unstoppable when he gets there. He feels a spark of pleasure in that. He guesses he ought not to, but can no longer remember why. He fires and fires again. Dantin has fought on many worlds before, but not like this. It is better this way, though, he thinks. It is something he could learn to like. Not long after the battle was over and the world fell at the feet of the Lords of Silence, the former captain of the guard finally came to his senses. It was unknown how long he had been walking, or rather, moved aimlessly to the outskirts of the city they had captured. He could see almost nothing. His eyes were no longer able to distinguish colours. He had killed many. The blood on his hands was still warm, and he occasionally licked up drops of it. Eventually he's on the edge of the city. He can smell salt, and he feels a chill wind against his face. He shivers, wondering if he should go back the way he came. The walls are little more than piles of broken stone. He could just keep on walking and the cliff edge will come. For some reason he knows how steep those cliffs are, and how far he would fall. The rain is freezing, and what remains of his clothing sticks to his body. He staggers, he slips. Before long the walls are behind him and the rocks are becoming slippery with foam. He can hear the crash of surf, and he sees clouds racing. It will not take long, he will hardly feel it. But then there is a shape in the mist, a pillar of stone that slides out of the fog. "Captain Dantin," says the pillar. He concentrates, hard. The pillar becomes larger and more defined, swelling into the colossal shape of a monster. It moves, and he sees arms and legs. There are fat little horrors that squat all over it and books hanging from chains about its neck. A ragged cowl is sodden in the downpour. "Captain Dantin," the monster says again, "stay where you are." The thing comes closer. He does as he is told, of course. He waits, panting softly, the rainwater coursing over what remains of his body. From somewhere, he pulls out a name, Philemon. the corpse counter. The monster looks in bad shape, wounded perhaps or merely bedraggled. Amid all the flotsam and junk that festoons his body, there are bags hanging at his belt and some are damp with something thicker than water. "You were hard to find," says Philemon irritably. "I thought we might have lost you already. By the God, look at you." He can barely understand the words. Everything is grey. His only motivation, to the extent that he still has one, is to keep walking and maybe find that drop into oblivion. Philemon reaches for his belt and pulls out a pouch, one that looks vaguely familiar. "Vaux is not wholly pleased with me," he says. Dantine wasn't happy about that. Probably nothing could do it anymore. He looked at the bag swinging in the monster's claws. There was nothing he could do. He didn't fight back. He walked on, knowing that only darkness awaited him further inside the ship. The ground was quaking so loudly that he did not even hear the demigod approaching. He turned his head, seeing a giant clad in warplate of shining pearl, webbed with veins of deep purple, standing over him. One of the giant's hands was a gigantic gauntlet of drills and cutting tools. The other held a boxy silver pistol that was bigger than Dyrance's head. Life. The giant's voice was like a soft avalanche filtered through a cloud of wasps, low and measured but unable to mask the undeniable threat the demigod exuded by its very presence alone. Slowly it raised the pistol, levelling it at Dyrance. Or death. The serf's blood ran cold. Despite the furnace heat of the crash site, his teeth would not cease chattering. He stared into the barrel of the pistol, a wide black eye that swelled to encompass his entire world. Everything else, all sights and sounds and smells, faded away into the background in the face of the doom promised by the cold iron circle. Life. Dyrance managed to choke from behind a terror-locked jaw, the act of speaking the word feeling as though it were the heaviest weight he had ever lifted. The demigod remained inhumanly still, unaffected by his answer. The pistol did not waver from the head of the prostrate slave. It was at that moment that Dyrance noticed the huddled crowd of dazed men and women behind the legionaries' armoured bulk, fear keeping them silent and compliant for their new master. With a soft purr of armour servos, the demigod lifted the pistol, taking its barrel from between Dyrance's eyes as the serf rose shakily to his feet. Life! When fighting with the servants of pernicious forces, one can never be sure of the outcome of the battle, because often the decisions and actions of the forces of chaos can be unexpected for them, even more so than for the enemy. And when the battlefield is once again left to those who have learned the touch of the immaterium, it will be time to collect the spoils. Surviving weapons, repairable armoured vehicles, parts of power armour, and most importantly, prisoners. Those who were unlucky enough to be alive when the nightmare creatures unleashed their insane fury upon them. Unlucky, exactly. For in this case, death would have been an escape from the horror that the cruelty and fantasies of their captors are capable of. This is especially true when it comes to the followers of Slaanesh. For their dark lord favours those who are able to cast aside all restraints of morality and devote themselves fully to perfection in all possible and impossible forms of pleasure. Dyrance could not conceive of an answer that was anything short of terrifying. He had learned of the broken remnants of the Three Legion in the barest snatches of his master's conversations. The Pitker had even run afoul of their like before, though it had been little more than a skirmish between two small schools of vessels, too distracted by their own disrepair to give battle. He had never seen the Emperor's children before the crash, and if even a fraction of the things his lords had said had any truth, the wisest course he could take would be to find the surest way of snapping his own neck. Over the millennia of indulging their need for pleasure, the bodies of those Astartes who had chosen Slaanesh over the other gods had lost their former sensitivity. Not even the modified nervous system of a space marines could operate in such a frenzied mode. Each time their bodies demanded crazier and crazier things. With each fight, sensitivity became more and more dulled until they realized with horror that they could no longer feel the fullness of emotion. For any follower of Slaanesh, this was worse than any torture, yet they found a way. Some, like the composer, the sorcerer of Lucius's gang, revel in achieving their own goal. Some, like the few apothecaries, though most, like Fabius Bile, do not consider themselves followers of the dark god, have withdrawn entirely into their work. But most have found relief in ambrosia, a murderous chemical cocktail that can bring them back to their senses for a short time. Once one of the greatest legions of Astartes had long ago turned into a gang of deranged drug addicts, and it was not hard to guess what awaited those unfortunate enough to fall into their hands. The fate of a slave was never something desirable for a normal person. But the fate of a slave of the servants of the forces of destruction will seem to most people at least one of those things that is much worse than death. There was no telling exactly what might await a particular person. Will he become another receptacle for another demon? Will he fall victim to another apothecary's cruel experiments? Will he be destined to become an ordinary battery that fuels the power of the sorcerer? Or is he destined to be a banal fate of cannon fodder or cheap labor? All of the above options for the development of events are not an exhaustive description, rather only a small fraction of what can await a man in the captivity of the Slaanesh cultists. After all, the followers of the Prince of Pleasure are very different from the same followers of Khorne, whose thirst for battle did not deprive them of banal human logic. The same cannot be said of the followers of Slaanesh. The faces shrieked all the louder, spiking in a hopeless crescendo as they melted from the walls, exposing the bloody frescoes and sweat-soaked tapestries beneath as they slid down with a sickening slowness to the floor. They were dragged towards the enthroned figure, captives in an angler's net being hauled in for harvest. For a moment they pooled, quivering beneath him, before slipping upwards, wrapping themselves around muscular limbs and a torso rapidly resolving into form and definition. A hiss of pleasure pain passed from the figure as the jelly of bound souls hardened into segmented plates of baroque armor, continuously emitting a cracking, splitting noise as the faces upon its surface bobbed and wailed their futile cries. The figure braced himself internally as the calm solitude of his mind was shattered. Dozens of voices cried out behind his eyes. Pain, despair, pleading and rage all mingled and overlapped inside his skull as the stolen howled their torment within his mind. They begged him for deliverance, swore vindication, or taunted him in their despair, scratching and needling and ringing in a never-ending discordance of the damned. The figure rose to his feet. The cavorting fiends upon the floor ceased their debauchery, fleeing from him in terror. Ropes of muscle, the red of raw meat unspooled from his right arm. Spines and hooked barbs burst forth along the twitching mass, drooling sickly venom that sizzled as it pattered to the floor. The glistening lash stretched across the ground for a moment before drawing back and coiling around the right forearm of the figure. He reached out with his left arm, and an attendant wretch waddled to his side on its knees. The slave made a simpering, choked sound, its lips quivering around the hilt of the sword sheathed in its throat. Its master took the blade's grip in his clawed gauntlet, sparing its bearer the briefest of glances, which drew a gasp of elation from its bleeding lips. The use of humans as sword sheaths is far from the perverse imagination of Slaanesh's servants. The fourth god of chaos patronizes all forms of pleasure at once, from mad orgies to high art. However, even so sublime and subtle a mode of pleasure as music can take unimaginable perverted forms. All you have to do is choose the right instrument. Lucius was greeted by a chorus of screams. Men and women lined the walls, clutched in the grip of horrid spider-like constructs of crystal and tarnished silver. Their limbs, hair, and in some cases their skin had all been removed, leaving them as little more than twitching husks of abused meat and terrified pleading eyes that shone wetly in the rose-hued light of torches. Worms of jade energy stitched over their raw flesh, provoking screams of pain that impossibly grew louder and more agonized as their suffering was continually eclipsed by fresh torment. The constructs moved to different sockets across the walls in a chilling dance, arraying their captives' howling bodies in shifting, sickening patterns. They formed disorienting runes that itched at Lucius's flesh and brought stinging black tears welling in his eyes. The mouths of the victims, pinned back and stretched open by the machine's dagger claws, bled frost and corpuscent as they fed their ceaseless cries into the staring faces of elaborate masks of porcelain and tarnished gold. Conduits of tubing trailed from the painted grins of the masks, glittering with warp frost as they linked and intertwined like a spider's web around the spiraling tower at the center of the chamber. However, as in the case of the Nurgle's forces, the most frightening thing is that the human being is often victimized voluntarily. It is not uncommon for the followers of Slaanesh to turn their servants into real drug addicts, letting them taste pleasures, often given by the same substance that brings the Marines themselves to their senses. However, it has a much stronger effect on unmodified bodies, turning a person into an obedient slave, willing to do anything to forget where they are and who they are for a short time. This is exactly what happened to Dyrunk, a man who had been a lifelong slave to the services of pernicious forces and had lived a miserable existence aboard the Pitkur, a ship belonging to the Khorne's cult under the command of the Scarlet Centurion. During a battle between the Khorne's forces and Lucius's gang, the Pitkur was wrecked and a deep clunk sounded from somewhere around Dirence, causing his teeth to clench involuntarily. Though he could not feel it, he was certain his skin was crawling, as if a vibrating piece of machinery were hovering just above it. A modicum of his vision returned, enough for him to glimpse a willowy figure standing over him. It was inhumanly tall and thin, a hairless androgynous thing sheathed in a body glove of shining black rubber. It peered down at him, smiling a smile that was too wide with a mouth that had too many teeth. The figure raised a hand up to Dirence, its soft flesh pale as milk. Its palm was open, holding a small mound of pinkish powder. Dirence's tongue felt thick and heavy, his mouth dry as he tried to choke out words. His words were stolen by a soft hiss that muted all other sound. The androgynous creature breathed out, softly throwing the rosy dust into Dirence's face. The powder billowed over him, warm against the frigid air, as it wrapped itself around his body. It felt like silk, and the surf released the breath he'd been holding to allow it passage within him. It had barely brushed his nostrils before he was gasping. Dirence lurched forwards, greedily inhaling as much of the musk as he could. It was the same joyful mist that he had tasted upon the Pitkur, only somehow more. The cold vanished, and the stale recycled air with it. Perfume took its place, sublimely potent and yet subtle at the same time. The deep thrum of engines faded away, along with the musical giggling of the creature as a sweet, bright chirping plucked at his ears. Dirence slowly opened his eyes fully and found that after a few blinks to clear his vision, he was no longer blind. He was in a garden. Dirence was sitting upon a low, overstuffed couch, skinned in deep scarlet silk. It was soft to his touch, so soft it felt as though he would sink into it forever. He realized with a start that he was pressing against its plush surface with his hand, the hand he thought he had lost in the crash. He held it to his face, marveling at its smooth, undamaged flesh, before he turned his gaze to his surroundings. Everything around him was lush and green. Flowers swelled on vines with a riot of spectacularly tender blooms. A stream of water, not the rust-thickened leakages of corroded ductwork, but glittering, crystal-clear water, chuckled as it wound through the greenery. There was more vegetation in this small garden than Dirence had seen in his entire life. Small shapes flitted hither and yon amongst the blossoms, their plumage representing every colour of the spectrum. They hovered with easy grace, drinking of the nectar that glistened from the flowers, before darting back to the air in a blur of gently flapping wings. It was from the tiny beaks of these creatures that the singing was coming. Dirence had never seen a bird before, nor had he heard their birdsong. Such things had been confined to the few shattered picts and mouldering tomes left in what had once been the Pitkur's libraries, the few that had survived being casually destroyed by the masters or burned for warmth by the mortal crew. In the face of survival, they had been an irrelevance, but now he understood the full measure of what they were. The substance gave Dirence the greatest pleasures and peace. Inside his dreams, he was not a slave. There were no endless corridors of the spaceship around him, no traitorous Astartes who could kill him at any moment simply because he was in the wrong place. Ambrosia gave him life and sensations he had never known, but the effect was temporary and the price was pain. The mental pain of realizing the reality of the situation and the physical pain that the substance left behind, making him think of nothing but how to get more ambrosia. At some point, Dirence was ready for anything. Through the steady flow of essences, the Xenos form an unbreakable bond with the prince, said the composer as he stroked the face of one of the slaves. There exist entities within the ether that can see these rivers of agony as clearly as the light from a flame. All we must do is find one of these, Neverborn, and bind it to our purpose. We shall hunt the ones who hold the soul thief, and this being will lead us to them. The composer looked back at Dirence. Do you want to help me find this creature? Dirence struggled to respond. He could barely concentrate. The pain stitched nausea through his insides, almost bringing him to his knees. The composer withdrew a vial from his belt. His voice conveyed his smile, even through his mask. No? Even for a taste of this? Dirence's world dropped away, shoved aside by an electric buzzing hunger as he saw the ambrosia. All else faded but him and the contents of the vial. He had to have it. It was the one thing, the only thing, that could save him from his pain. "Please," Dirence begged, unable to look away from the powder. "Please, let me have it. I have to have it. And I want to give it to you," the composer answered fervently. "But my charity has reached its limit. This is a gift that you must earn." Dirence shook. Spittle flecked from his lips. "Luring the demon we seek to us is a simple enough task," said the composer. "It is a creature of betrayal, forged from fratricide. It is the murder of innocence incarnated, and there is no better lure for such a thing than that which constitutes itself." The sorcerer gestured to the group of prostrate slaves. "It would of course be easy for me to do this, but it would be the butchery of cattle. It would barely qualify as murder, an unpalatable enticement to its hunger. Do you see?" Dirence could not think. He could barely breathe. The rush, the euphoria. He could not hope for those any longer. All he wanted was to claw himself back to who he had been at the start. His bloodshot eyes bulged, as if they could somehow take the vial of ambrosia from the composer's palm, if he just stared hard enough. "The more you help me, the more of this you shall get." The composer shook the vial as he leaned forwards. "Do I have your interest?" "Yes," Dirence finally managed to stammer. He felt something within him die with the word. Something irreplaceable. Give me a gun, I'll do it." The composer slowly shook his head. "This is an exceedingly primeval demon, little one." He produced a simple machete the length of Dirence's arm, a hacking blade that would not have appeared out of place in the grip of a death-whirled jungle primitive. They so delight in the arcane and the theatrical. In order to suit its tastes, our methods must have a more antiquated flavor to them. Is it worth mentioning that Dirence ended up becoming a receptacle for the demon he had summoned? Such things are common among the followers of pernicious forces. However, if, for example, the followers of Nurgle, even if they do not feel boundless sympathy for their slaves, are simply physically incapable of hating them or wishing to hurt them, then for the Slaanish's slaves, the slaves are only toys, tools for achieving their goals and pleasures. After all, for all living beings, there is essentially only one choice: perfection or death. And these wretched creatures are as far from perfection as it is possible to be. Billions of its denizens lived, breathed and murdered within the dagger cathedrals of the Poison City and the endless slums that sprawled beneath them. The combined energy of an entire race was devoted to perfecting the art of extracting the most complete and utter suffering from those taken in their raids across the real space beyond the webway. Yet this was but a single node of the impossibly vast city, one that rooted itself across countless passages of the webway like a virus. And the satellite arena Lucia stood upon was but one of hundreds filling the black sky around the Dark Eldar's lair. For 10,000 years now, humanity has been waging a relentless war against the entire galaxy. For 10,000 years, more and more people have been giving their lives on thousands of planets, struggling to fight back against every conceivable horror of the cosmos. However, no matter how strong the armies of the Imperium are, they are not capable of winning victories forever. And so the battlefield is once again left to the enemy. Once again, the few survivors begin to envy their fallen comrades, held captive by creatures who use words like mercy and sanity only as a mockery. The Dark Eldar, a fragment of a race of sentient beings that once dominated the galaxy, are just such creatures. And while the Elder of the Shipworlds seeks salvation from the one that hungers in the stones of souls, others has found a slightly different way to preserve their souls from being devoured by the hungry monster. Strong emotions and suffering in an effort to delay the inevitable, the Dark Eldar subject millions of living beings to unimaginable torture every second. After all, the right of the strong is often the only truly working law in Commorragh. And it's hard to imagine what could be worse than being captured by creatures whose only desire is to inflict pain. The floor of the hall was made of porcelain tiles covered in grooves that converged to hexagonal drains trimmed in silver. This detail, along with the many bright lights and chains hanging from the ceiling, said that this place was a fairground of bloodshed, where passers-by could enjoy a display of public torture and humiliation inflicted on slaves and zealous masochists alike. Eldar in general are renowned for their arrogance, often failing to recognize reason even in apparently intelligent beings. This is the only way to explain the fact that a strong enough warrior among the huge number of captives has a chance to get his hands on a weapon again, even if only to die in one of the numerous arenas of the Commorragh for the amusement of the public. Huge blocks of tiered seating, filled with throngs of Dark Eldar, floated and swirled around the bowl of battered stone. Xenos shouted and jeered up there, bickering and playing amongst themselves. Applause erupted in parts of the floating audience as arguments escalated into bloodshed. The bodies of the slain were thrown overboard into the abyss. However, how interesting and entertaining a fight can show an ordinary Imperial Guard, even if there are hundreds of them. Such a thing will quickly bore any of the Dark Eldar, because their salvation directly depends on their emotions, and monotony is the surest way to quickly lose interest. Space Marines, who may be hard to capture but quite easy to make fight, or even one of the champions of chaos chosen by the hungry bitch herself. Lucius Eternal, who found himself in the Commorragh arena under Fabius Bile's plan. A jagged, roughly circular landscape of blackened rock stretched around Lucius, broken at all angles by barbed spears of bladed stone and metal that ranged from 3 to 50 meters in length. Bodies littered the ground or were impaled upon the spears in various states of ruination and decay. They represented humans, various Xenos breeds, and even warriors of the Legiones and Adeptus Astartes. Lucius glimpsed that, with only a few exceptions, all of the demigod corpses bore the heraldry of the Three Legion. Vast blocks of tiered seats floated and revolved around the bowl of broken stone, brimming with throngs of Dark Eldar. The aliens screamed and jeered down upon the arena as they bickered and gambled amongst themselves. The cheers would spike in localized sections of the floating audience as arguments boiled over into bloodshed, and the bodies of the slain were hurled over the sides to fall the fathomless distance below. Baroque pleasure barges and anti-gravitic craft ringed the edge of the stadium as Commorrite aristocrats surrounded by slaves and courtiers took in the spectacle from where they lounged upon exquisite couches crafted from undying, tortured flesh. Acrobats flew and vaulted through the air between the barges in colourful costumes, duelling and slashing at each other with daggers and bladed lances. Lucius's eyes were drawn past the rippling sails of the alien pleasure craft, the Eternal lost for a moment as he absorbed the spectacle surrounding him. Commorragh, the black heart of the Dark Elder realm, filled the sky like a mound of shattered blades. The blackened spines of towers burst across its surface in all directions, their foundations swallowed by a dark metropolis of flesh markets and sprawling industrial dungeons. The skies were thronged with vessels of all sizes, flitting and drifting between the bladed edifices of shipping nexuses and extravagant floating palaces. Billions of its denizens lived, breathed and murdered within the dagger cathedrals of the poisoned city and the endless slums that sprawled beneath them. The combined energy of an entire race was devoted to perfecting the art of extracting the most complete and utter suffering from those taken in their raids across the real space beyond the webway. Yet this was but a single node of the impossibly vast city, one that rooted itself across countless passages of the webway like a virus. And the satellite arena Lucius stood upon was but one of hundreds, filling the black sky around the Dark Elder's lair. Lucius made his way forwards through the perpetually shifting forest of immense spikes. Of course, Lucius, albeit not without the help of Fabius Bile, managed to escape alive from captivity, and even freed a few 3rd Legion Astartes, joining them to his warp gang. However, most in such arenas inevitably find their deaths. But as exciting as such a spectacle can be, even it can get boring sooner or later. In addition, not all captured prisoners are suitable for combat, whether due to weakness or injury. However, the fate of such captives is often much worse than that of their stronger counterparts. After all, they somehow meet their often rather quick death with a weapon in their hands, while the rest await a much worse fate. And the most useless ones can always be hunted down in a fun way. Zagor, trembling, hid behind a bush and listened to the horrible screams that carried between the spires of the lodges, rising on all sides. A few moments later, he saw the silhouettes of a pair of hellions cleaving the air high overhead. Yes, there was a hunt going on, and judging by the sounds, a very lively one. Archon Malixian's passion for flying creatures of all kinds was legendary, and he felt it necessary to exercise his pets from time to time. Several dozen slaves would be brought into the enclosures and allowed to scatter, and then the cages would be opened, releasing fanged, clawed and poisonous death in a multitude of winged guises. The Archon's cabal would take off with their lord to savour the pain and horror of the dying slaves who had fallen victim to the hunt. Any prey that deluded itself with the hope of hiding or being desperate enough to fight back was also massacred. With a sharp whoosh, the pack of predators rushed down. The raider rushed after them and disappeared from sight again, hidden by the cages. Flashes flashed behind the bars, and a moment later the distant crackle of splintering fire reached Zagor. I think someone's taken up the cause. The concept of slavery among the Dark Elder differs little from that of other intelligent races, the only difference being that a friend of the Hari is far more likely to torture slaves simply for the sake of the process. Entire streets of Comorra can be reserved for this activity alone. Dark Eldar themselves are often among the victims, for many of them have long loved pain in all its manifestations, and are not the least bit embarrassed not only to inflict it, but also to accept it. However, even among such masochists, there are hardly any willing to voluntarily fall into the hands of Homunculi, a true expert in the field of pain, a sculptor of flesh, whose knowledge and imagination can realize the most unimaginable atrocities, the mention of which can make even Hari's friend shiver. In the end, even death is often no escape from the endless ocean of pain into which any victim of the Homunculi will inevitably plunge. Any Homunculi is a master of all things painful, but the most gifted of them can twist the very essence of a human being, make him not just serve himself, but turn him into something that will inspire terror in even the Dark Eldar. Disgusting grotesques, mad creatures whirling through the battlefield in a destructive whirlwind, are only one of the most innocuous forms of what the Homunculi mind is capable of. The real masterpiece, however, would undoubtedly be Talos, a semi-intelligent fighting machine that collects the remains of the already dead and captures the still living. Talos is undoubtedly the ultimate expression of any Homunculi's skill, for only their twisted minds could put together a fighting machine and a torture tool. Zagor recognized the maker of that spiked stinger before he even saw the magnificent machine in its entirety. The device rustled forward on invisible gravimotors, obviously seeking out a new customer to imprison in the filigree bone cage. Jointed arms like insect paws rose at its sides and curved with exquisite malice, displaying an array of blades, saws, hooks and probes. Most of the aristocrats carefully moved out of the way of the machine, not wanting to attract its attention, which was now occupied by the acolyte. Zagor, on the other hand, simply stood mesmerized by her resplendent beauty. She floated closer, clearly intrigued by his stillness. In theory, Talos was nothing more than a mobile torture machine with no mind. His Zaga saw that the current client was nearing the end of his journey and wondered how long he had been a prisoner here. The conscience-built Talos worked as skillfully as a surgeon. Machines built by Vlokarian, on the other hand, were said to be able to keep clients alive for centuries. It was also rumoured that in the millennia since their creator had passed away, they had acquired something of a strange semblance of their own consciousness. Captivity by the enemies of humanity is not the best prospect for any soldier. And to be fair, humans themselves are no worse at inflicting pain than anyone else. However, the Dark Eldar are the most real masters in this business, able to compete even with the followers of Slaanesh. After all, it is the fourth god of chaos who is the cause of all the atrocities that take place in Comorar. His legs were torn off, the pain circuits of his gifts to Omnisia exposed and attached to Orc's terrifyingly machines. But the suffering that the mechanic and torture doctor inflicted upon him was nothing compared to the pain and sense of defilement that the Orc's actions caused him. Throughout its history, mankind has fought endless wars, from the rage of a savage trying to survive in a harsh environment to cold strategic calculation and orders for nuclear strikes. People have constantly perfected this art. From ancient times to the present day, war has been one of the main engines of technological progress and has left a very distinct imprint on the culture of civilizations. However, when fighting among themselves, people adopt sometimes unspoken and sometimes official rules of war. Still, not all of us are cruel psychopaths, and wars in our time are rarely fought to the point of total destruction. As it happens, victory or death is far from the only possible outcome for a soldier on the battlefield. The enemy rarely aims to exterminate every last one of them. Besides, a wounded and concussed soldier who has lost his fighting ability is often more profitable to capture alive in order to extract valuable information from him, to exchange him for his prisoners, or banally, to make him work. However, in the realities of the distant future, such an outcome is almost always much worse than death. After all, the Xenos never signed any agreements. For 10,000 years, the Imperium of mankind has been waging an endless war against every possible and impossible horror of the cosmos. Cruel and insane forces of chaos, calculating and cunning Eldar driven by unquenchable hunger, Tyranids, and, of course, Orcs. Despite their barbaric lifestyle and very specific military-industrial complex, have managed to become the truest plague of the galaxy. There is not a single planet, not one of the darkest corners of space, where they have not heard of green-skinned savages. Huge mobs numbering millions appear everywhere as if from nowhere and unleash their war on new and new worlds. Of course, the inhabitants of the galaxy, including humans, have long adapted to this threat. But the unpredictability and sheer numbers of Orcs, time after time, allow them to wreak havoc wherever they appear. And while being captured by Orcs may seem far preferable to being captured by Dark Eldar or forces of chaos, the prospect is still somewhere between better to shoot yourself and better to burn alive in a chimera. To an outside observer, the behavior of the Orcs may seem like the highest degree of ignorance and idiocy, but they are definitely pragmatic and economical. Those unlucky enough to survive and be captured by the green-skinned are likely to find themselves in one of the slave cages with thousands of their kin, and now their fate will depend solely on the twisted minds of the Xenos. At the end of the shift, the fatigue was so all-encompassing that we used to fall into slumber as soon as we were shooed back into the cage. Since we couldn't lay down, we slept standing up, falling into each other. Commissioner Sebastian Yarrick found himself in the hands of the Orcs during the events of Golgotha, when Imperium Marines gathered from all nearby planets were chasing after Gazkul in order to kill the Orcs' leader. However, during the battle it turned out that Gazkul's army was far more numerous than anticipated, and as a result, the Imperium forces, along with Yarrick, found themselves surrounded. Waking up in the hands of the Orcs, Yarrick found himself suspended on chains over a deep pit. Gazkul personally greeted him on his wanderer, dropping the commissioner into that very pit. Yarrick was able to climb out. The bottom of the well turned out to be inhabitable. After a few days, the commissioner was able to build a makeshift ladder by hammering the sharp and sturdy fangs of the squigs living at the bottom of the well into the steep wall. Once on the surface, however, Jarek found himself in a cage with the rest of the prisoners. After several long and arduous days, the Commissar was able to gather his men and formulate an escape plan, during which the space wanderer Gazkula was severely damaged. The Orcs had feared Jarek before, but Gazkul himself respected him as an adversary and preferred to let his best enemy go so that he could fight him again. The Commissioner was given everything back and escorted to the shuttlecraft with honours. Chief Gazkul Mage Uruk Traka personally met the Commissioner at the gangway. "Grandiose fight," he pronounced. He straightened his giant clawed finger and tapped me once on the chest. "My best enemy!" He stepped aside and made a gesture toward the ramp. "Go to Armageddon," he said. "Prepare for the grandest fight of all." Of course, war and captivity were never on the list of things everyone wanted to try. And in the darkness of the distant future, the fate of a soldier caught in the hands of the enemy is often far worse than any death that might have overtaken him on the battlefield. The madness and brutality of the forces of chaos, along with the unnatural nature of the immaterium, will make you wish for a simple death. The calculating Tau will take from you everything that made you human, and for the Dark Eldar, torturing captives is the basis of their existence. And Orcs' captivity is no exception to that rule. After all, the Greenskins have earned their reputation as savages.